At the end of the last ice age, around 10,000 BCE, the glaciers that had once covered much of northern Europe receded, and the British Isles gradually emerged into a landscape of forests, rivers, and rolling plains. Britain was not yet an island. A great land bridge, known as Doggerland, connected it to continental Europe, allowing bands of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers to cross on foot. They hunted red deer, aurochs, and wild boar, and they fished in the rich rivers and coasts. By around 6,500 BCE, rising sea levels caused by melting glaciers submerged Doggerland, cutting Britain off from the mainland. From then on, the island's communities developed with both isolation and outside influence shaping their story. By about 4000 BCE, the Neolithic Revolution had reached Britain. Farming communities began to appear, cultivating wheat and barley, and raising domesticated cattle and sheep. This period saw the emergence of permanent settlements and collective ritual sites. The most enduring of these monuments are megalithic structures such as Stonehenge, whose earliest phases began around 3000 BCE and continued in stages for more than a millennium. Aligned with the solstices, its great stones mark the deep relationship these societies had with the cycles of the sun and moon. Other sites, like Avebury's vast stone circle and the great burial mounds of Silbury Hill, testify to a people who combined subsistence farming with an elaborate spiritual life. The Bronze Age began in Britain around 2500 BCE with the arrival of the so-called bell beaker culture, bringing new burial practices, metalworking, and long-distance connections with continental Europe. Bronze weapons, ornaments, and tools changed the rhythms of daily life and warfare. By 800 BCE, the Iron Age arrived, ushering in the era of Celtic tribes. These Celts, who spoke related languages and practiced shared religious rituals, dominated much of Britain and Ireland. They built hill forts like Maiden Castle, lived in roundhouses, and cultivated a warrior aristocracy. Their societies were tribal rather than centralized, bound by kinship, warfare, and shifting alliances. Religious life was centered on Druids, the priestly class whose power was both spiritual and political. Though we know little from their own voices, later Roman accounts describe them as arbiters, teachers, and sacrificers. Celtic Britain was not isolated. It was part of a wider Atlantic cultural world that stretched into Gaul, Iberia, and beyond. By the middle of the first millennium BCE, Britain was known to Mediterranean traders. Tin from Cornwall and lead from Somerset were exchanged for wine, glass, and fine goods from Rome and Gaul. By the 1st century BCE, the rising power of Rome turned its gaze north. In 55 BCE, Julius Caesar launched his first expedition across the English Channel. Though his forces won some skirmishes, they did not establish a permanent presence. Caesar returned in 54 BCE with a larger force, defeating several tribes and taking hostages, but again he withdrew, content to claim tribute and symbolic submission. For nearly a century, Rome left Britain largely to its own tribal dynamics. But Caesar's expeditions revealed the islands to the Mediterranean world and opened the path for future conquest. That conquest came under Emperor Claudius in 43 CE. A Roman army of around 40,000 men crossed the Channel, landing in Kent and marching into the heart of southern Britain. They quickly secured victories over the Cativalani tribe and established control over the Thames Valley. Claudius himself traveled to Britain later that year, receiving the surrender of several tribes and cementing the annexation. Roman Britain, Britannia, was born. The Romans founded towns to anchor their control. Londinium, built on the banks of the Thames, grew into a bustling commercial hub. Camulodunum, modern Colchester, served as the first provincial capital. Roman roads stitched the landscape together. Watling Street, Ermine Street, and Fossway linked garrisons, towns, and forts, allowing legions to march quickly. Villas dotted the countryside, bringing Roman-style farming and architecture to the elite. Baths, amphitheaters, and temples reshaped urban life. But conquest was not uncontested. In 60 or 61 CE, Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe, led a massive uprising against Roman rule. Her forces burned Londinium, Camulodunum, and Verulamium, killing tens of thousands. For a moment, Roman control teetered on the brink. Yet the governor, Suetonius Paulinus, regrouped his forces and crushed the revolt in a decisive battle. Boudica's rebellion ended in blood, but it left a lasting memory of resistance that endured in later centuries. Over the next decades, Roman forces expanded northward and westward, subduing Wales and pushing into modern Scotland. In 122 CE, Emperor Hadrian ordered the construction of a vast stone wall across northern Britain, stretching 73 miles from coast to coast. Hadrian's wall was not just a military fortification, but a statement of imperial control, marking the boundary of Roman authority. Later, in 142 CE, the Antonine Wall was built further north, though it was abandoned within a generation. Roman Britain remained centered on the line of Hadrian's Wall, with garrisons manning forts and watchtowers for centuries. Culturally, Roman Britain was a place of fusion. Latin spread as the language of administration, though Celtic dialects survived. Roman law, taxation, and governance tied local elites to the empire. Trade linked Britain with Gaul and the Mediterranean. Religion reflected the cosmopolitan nature of the empire. Roman gods were worshipped alongside Celtic deities, and mystery cults of Mithras and Isis found followers among soldiers and civilians. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, Christianity began to spread, with evidence of early churches in Londinium and elsewhere. Yet Britain was never entirely pacified. The northern tribes, the Picts, continued to resist Roman control, raiding across Hadrian's Wall. On the coasts, Saxon raiders from across the North Sea began to test defenses. By the late 4th century, the Roman Empire itself was in crisis. Pressures on the Rhine and Danube frontiers demanded troops elsewhere, and Britain's strategic importance declined. In 410 CE, the Emperor Honorius, facing invasions across the empire, told the cities of Britain to see to their own defense. Roman legions withdrew, leaving towns, roads, and villas to decay or adapt. For nearly 350 years, Britain had been part of the Roman world. Its departure left a power vacuum that would invite new peoples, new kingdoms, and a new chapter of history. The legacy of Roman Britain endured in its towns, its roads, its walls, and in the memory of an island that had once been the edge of empire. When the legions of Rome finally withdrew from Britain in 410 CE, a centuries-long order crumbled into fragments. In his rescript of that year, the Emperor Honorius advised the cities of Britain to see to their own defense. Roman governors, soldiers, and administrators departed. The once mighty towns, paved roads, and villas built across the land were left vulnerable. Yet Roman influence did not vanish overnight. Sub-Roman communities endured in western regions like Wales and Cornwall, and for generations local leaders still clung to Latin literacy, Roman customs, and Christian traditions. It was into this fractured landscape that new peoples arrived. From across the North Sea came waves of migrants, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, tribes from what is now Denmark, northern Germany, and the Netherlands. Tradition, preserved in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, tells us that around 449 CE two brothers, Hengist and Horsa, were invited by a British ruler named Vortigern as mercenaries. But the story soon darkened. These mercenaries turned settlers, seizing land for themselves. Archaeology suggests that settlement was not one sudden invasion, but a gradual influx spanning the 5th and 6th centuries. Still, the result was transformative. The old Romano-British order collapsed across much of eastern and southern Britain, while Brittonic-speaking communities were pushed west into Wales, Cornwall, and across the Channel into Brittany. As these Germanic newcomers carved out kingdoms, they brought their language, Old English, which blended with surviving Celtic and Latin words, but over time became the dominant tongue of the land. Christianity waned at first in Saxon territories, but it would soon be revived. In 597 CE, Pope Gregory the Great sent a mission under Augustine to Kent. The King of Kent, Ethelbert, converted, and Canterbury became the seat of a new archbishopric. Meanwhile, from the opposite direction, Irish missionaries spread the faith through northern Britain, most notably St. Aidan, who founded the monastery of Lindisfarne in 635. Thus, two streams of Christianity, Roman and Celtic, converged to re-Christianize the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. By the 7th century, the map of England had become a patchwork of rival realms often described as the Heptarchy: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex. This term was coined much later, but it captures the shifting balance of power. Northumbria, forged from British Nisha and Dara, dominated under King Edwin, 616 to 633, and later Oswald, 634 to 642, who made Lindisfarne a center of spirituality. Mercia rose under King Offa, 757 to 796, remembered for building Offa's Dyke, an earthwork marking his frontier with Wales. But these kingdoms, already at war with one another, faced a new and more devastating foe. In 793 CE, a band of seaborne raiders stormed the monastery of Lindisfarne. The attack shocked contemporaries, and chroniclers saw it as divine punishment. This was the beginning of the Viking Age. For decades, Norse raiders struck monasteries and coastal settlements. But in 865 CE, a far more dangerous force arrived: the Great Heathen Army. Led by the sons of Ragnar Lodbrok, Halfdan, Ubba, and Ivar the Boneless, they landed in East Anglia and swept inland. By 867 CE, they had captured York, making it the capital of a Viking kingdom in northern England. The struggle between Saxon and Dane reshaped England. Kingdoms fell one after another to the Norse until only Wessex stood firm under King Alfred, later called Alfred the Great. In 878 CE, at Edington, Alfred won a decisive victory against Guthrum's Viking army. He forced the Norse to accept baptism and retreat beyond a frontier that became known as the Danelaw. Though the Danelaw was not a fixed line but a shifting zone of settlement, its legacy endured in the landscape. Towns ending in, by, and thorp, laws and customs rooted in Norse tradition, and intermarriages that blended cultures. Alfred fortified his realm with a network of walled towns, ensuring survival. He also promoted learning, translating Latin works into Old English, leaving a cultural legacy as enduring as his military one. The century that followed saw Wessex kings gradually extend their authority. Alfred's grandson, Athelstan, achieved what none before him had done. In 927 CE, he conquered the Viking kingdom of York, bringing all the English under one rule. In 937 CE, at the Battle of Brunanburh, Athelstan led a coalition of Saxons and Mercians against an alliance of Scots, Norse, and Britons. His victory was so decisive that chroniclers called him the first true king of England. His reign, 924 to 939, is remembered as a turning point, though unity was fragile. The Norse threat returned in waves. In the late 10th century, Viking raiders came again, more organized and relentless. King Athelred II, who reigned from 978 to 1016, sought to buy them off with heavy payments known as Danegeld. His nickname, the Unready, comes not from lack of preparation but from the Old English unread, meaning bad counsel. Despite his efforts, the kingdom fell to Nut the Great, a Danish king who ruled England from 1016 to 1035. Knut's North Sea Empire stretched across England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden, and for a time, England was firmly integrated into a Scandinavian sphere. When Knut's heirs died without issue, the crown passed in 1042 to Edward the Confessor, son of Athelred. His reign, 1042 to 1066, restored a native dynasty, but his failure to produce an heir triggered a succession crisis. Upon his death in January 1066, Harold Godwin's son, England's most powerful noble, seized the throne. But two rival claimants loomed: Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, and William, Duke of Normandy. In September 1066, Harold Hardrada invaded with support from Harold's exiled brother Tostig. They met the English army at Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September. Harold Godwin's son won a crushing victory. Hardrada was killed, his army shattered. Yet even as Harold celebrated, news arrived that William had landed in Sussex. The final reckoning was at hand. The age of Anglo-Saxon England was about to end, swept away at the Battle of Hastings only weeks later. In January 1066, Edward the Confessor, King of England since 1042, died childless. His long reign, pious in character but politically fragile, left behind no direct heir. The Witenagemot, the Council of Nobles and Clergy, quickly chose Harold Godwin's son, the most powerful earl in England, to succeed him. Harold was crowned king on the 6th of January, but his claim was immediately contested by rivals who believed they had a greater right to the throne. Among them was William, Duke of Normandy, who asserted that Edward had promised him the crown years earlier and that Harold had sworn a sacred oath of support, an oath Harold allegedly broke. From the north came Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, who based his claim on an earlier treaty between English and Danish kings. England thus faced two invasions within the same year. In September 1066, Harold Hardrada landed in Yorkshire with a Norwegian force, joined by Harold Godwinson's estranged brother, Tostig. They defeated an English army at Fulford on September 20th. But only 5 days later, on September 25th, Harold Godwin's son marched north with unusual speed and crushed them at Stamford Bridge near York. Hardrada was slain, Tostig with him, and the Norwegian threat eliminated. Yet Harold had no time to rest. Even as the battle concluded, word arrived that William had landed in Sussex with his Norman army. Forced to march his weary troops south, Harold met William at Hastings on October 14, 1066. The Battle of Hastings was a turning point not only in English, but in European history. Harold's army, composed largely of infantry and housecarls, held the high ground behind a shield wall. The Normans, with cavalry, archers, and infantry, struggled to break it. Several feigned retreats, however, lured English troops from their position. In the chaos, Harold was killed, later legends said, by an arrow through his eye, and his army collapsed. William of Normandy was victorious, and on Christmas Day 1066, he was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The Norman Conquest transformed England profoundly. William rewarded his followers with vast estates, dispossessing the Anglo-Saxon nobility. The Domesday Book, completed in 1086, recorded in meticulous detail the lands and resources of the kingdom, enabling taxation and feudal control. Castles such as the Tower of London rose as symbols of dominance, while cathedrals in the Norman Romanesque style reshaped the landscape of worship. The English Church, while remaining loyal to Rome, was restructured under Norman bishops. French became the language of the elite, blending with Old English to create Middle English over time. William's successors faced constant turmoil. His son, William II, known as William Rufus, reigned from 1087 until his sudden death in a hunting accident in 1100. His younger brother, Henry I, seized the crown, issuing the Charter of Liberties as a pledge of good governance. Henry's reign saw administrative reform, but his death in 1135 triggered a crisis. His only legitimate son had drowned in the White Ship disaster of 1120, leaving his daughter, Empress Matilda, as heir. Yet on Henry's death, Stephen of Blois seized the throne, sparking nearly 2 decades of civil war known as the Anarchy, 1135 to 1153. Famine, lawlessness, and shifting loyalties scarred the land until a compromise was reached. Stephen would remain king, but Matilda's son Henry would succeed him. In 1154, Henry II became king, founding the Plantagenet dynasty. His reign, 1154 to 1189, established enduring institutions. Henry reformed the legal system, creating common law and royal courts that would shape English governance for centuries. Yet his reign was marred by his quarrel with Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury. Their conflict over the rights of church and crown ended with Becket's murder in 1170, an event that shocked Christendom and forced Henry into penance. Henry also ruled vast territories in France through marriage and inheritance, creating what historians later called the Angevin Empire. But his restless sons, Richard and John, rebelled against him in his later years. Richard I, known as Richard the Lionheart, succeeded in 1189. His reign was dominated by the Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192, where he won fame as a warrior king. Yet his absence from England left the realm vulnerable, and he spent only a handful of months there. Captured on his return, he was held for ransom, draining the treasury. Richard died in 1199 from a crossbow wound in France, leaving the crown to his brother John. King John's reign, 1199 to 1216, was one of turmoil and infamy. He lost most of England's French possessions, including Normandy, by 1204. His heavy taxation and arbitrary rule alienated barons and clergy alike. Conflict with Pope Innocent III led to England's excommunication for several years. In 1215, rebellion forced John to seal the Magna Carta at Runnymede, a charter guaranteeing rights to the barons and limiting royal power. Though John soon sought to annul it, Magna Carta became a cornerstone of constitutional history, reissued and reaffirmed by later kings. John died in 1216, leaving the throne to his 9-year-old son, Henry III. Henry III's long reign, 1216 to 1272, was troubled by baronial unrest and foreign influence at court. His lavish patronage of French relatives and costly projects, like the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey, fueled discontent. In 1264, civil war erupted under Simon de Montfort, who briefly captured the king and Edward I, son of Henry, reigned from 1272 to 1307. A formidable ruler and soldier, he subdued Wales, building great castles at Carnarvon and Conwy, and declared his son Prince of Wales in 1301. His campaigns in Scotland were less successful, though he defeated William Wallace and executed him in 1305. Resistance continued under Robert the Bruce. Edward also expelled England's Jewish population in 1290, an edict not rescinded until centuries later. His reign expanded royal administration and law, but also set the stage for prolonged Anglo-Scottish conflict. His son, Edward II, 1307 to 1327, proved far less effective. His reliance on favorites such as Piers Gaveston alienated the nobility. Defeat at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 secured Robert the Bruce's independence for Scotland. Discontent grew until Edward was deposed in 1327 by his wife Isabella and her ally Roger Mortimer. Edward was later murdered in captivity. His son Edward III, 1327 to 1377, restored royal authority and launched the Hundred Years' War with France in 1337. Asserting a claim to the French crown. Victories at Crécy, 1346, in Poitiers, 1356, established English military prestige, though gains were tenuous. Edward's reign also witnessed the Black Death, 1347 to 1351, which decimated the population and transformed society. Richard II, Edward's grandson, came to the throne as a child in 1377. His reign was rocked by the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, driven by heavy taxation and social tensions in the wake of the plague. Though Richard personally confronted the rebels at Smithfield, his later autocratic rule alienated the nobility. In 1399, he was deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV. The Lancastrian kings, Henry IV, 1399 to 1413, Henry V, 1413 to 1422, and Henry VI, 1422 to 1461, 1470 to 1471, carried England through triumphs and disasters. Henry V's victory at Agincourt in 1415 was legendary, and his marriage to Catherine of Valois briefly united the crowns of England and France. But his early death left an infant heir, Henry VI, whose reign descended into madness, civil war, and the Wars of the Roses. The Plantagenet dynasty, which had begun with Henry II in 1154, was riven by this conflict between the rival houses of Lancaster and York. It would not end until 1485, when Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at Bosworth Field, bringing the crown to the Tudors and closing the long Plantagenet chapter of English history. Under the reign of Henry VII, who secured the throne at the Battle of Bosworth on August 22, 1485, England transitioned from the chaos of civil war to a period of cautious consolidation. Henry's victory over Richard III ended the Wars of the Roses, and his subsequent marriage to Elizabeth of York in January 1486 symbolically united the warring houses of Lancaster and York, giving the Tudor dynasty its legitimacy. His reign, lasting until 1509, was characterized by a deliberate strengthening of royal authority. Henry curtailed the independence of the nobility by restricting their ability to maintain private armies through livery and maintenance, employing bonds and recognizances to enforce loyalty. He was careful with finances, increasing royal revenues through efficient taxation, trade treaties, and the revival of feudal dues. The 1497 Cornish Rebellion, sparked by resentment over heavy taxation for a campaign against Scotland, demonstrated the limits of his popularity, but also his effectiveness in suppressing uprisings. Foreign policy was pragmatic. He secured alliances through the marriage of his eldest son, Arthur, to Catherine of Aragon in 1501, and the Treaty of Medina del Campo, 1489, strengthened ties with Spain. The unexpected death of Arthur in 1502 shifted dynastic plans to Henry's second son, the future Henry VIII, laying the foundation for momentous change in the following reign. When Henry VII died on April 21, 1509, the throne passed to his 17-year-old son Henry VIII. His coronation ushered in a very different style of monarchy, marked by extravagance, personal charisma, and aggressive ambition. Initially popular, Henry married his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, after receiving papal dispensation, reinforcing the Spanish alliance. The early years of his reign were dominated by warfare against France, notably the Battle of the Spurs in 1513, and against Scotland, culminating in the English victory at Flodden Field on September 9, 1513, where James IV of Scotland was killed. Though Henry's military campaigns rarely brought lasting territorial gains, they enhanced his image as a warrior king. His court became a center of Renaissance culture, with figures such as Thomas More and Erasmus influencing intellectual life, while Cardinal Thomas Wolsey rose to dominate government administration until his fall in 1529. The decisive turn in Henry VIII's reign came with his failure to secure a male heir with Catherine of Aragon. Obsessed with dynastic security, Henry sought annulment of the marriage. Pope Clement VI's refusal, under pressure from Catherine's nephew, Emperor Charles V, prompted Henry to reject papal authority. Between 1532 and 1534, guided by Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer, Henry orchestrated the English Reformation. The Act of Supremacy, 1534, declared the king as supreme head of the Church of England, severing ties with Rome. The dissolution of the monasteries, 1536 to 1541, brought immense wealth into the crown's coffers, but also profound social and cultural upheaval. Henry's marital history, 6 wives in total, was entangled with political and religious shifts. His second marriage, II in Bullen, produced Elizabeth in 1533 but ended with Anne's execution in 1536. His third wife, Jane Seymour, gave birth to Edward in 1537, securing a male heir but dying shortly afterward. Subsequent marriages, II and of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr, reflected both political maneuvering and Henry's volatile temperament. Henry VIII's later years were marked by increasing tyranny, failing health, and costly wars in France and Scotland. His death on January 28, 1547, brought his 9-year-old son, Edward VI, to the throne. Edward's reign, 1547 to 1553, was dominated by regency governments, first under Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, and later under John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. The young king was a staunch Protestant, and his reign entrenched Protestant reforms more deeply than his father's had. The introduction of the Book of Common Prayer in 1549, revised in 1552, under Archbishop Cranmer, standardized worship in English and emphasized Reformed theology. However, these reforms sparked resistance, most notably the Prayer Book Rebellion in Devon and Cornwall in 1549, alongside Kett's Rebellion in Norfolk, which expressed deep social and economic grievances. Edward's frail health led to fears of Catholic restoration under his half-sister Mary. To prevent this, Northumberland engineered the succession of Lady Jane Grey in 1553, bypassing Mary and Elizabeth. But popular support for Mary was overwhelming, and Jane's 9-day reign ended swiftly when Mary entered London in July 1553 as the legitimate queen. Mary I, ruling from 1553 to 1558, sought to reverse the Protestant reforms and restore Catholicism. Her marriage to Philip II of Spain in 1554 was deeply unpopular, fueling xenophobic resentment and fears of Spanish dominance. The Wyatt Rebellion of that same year reflected this discontent but was suppressed. Mary earned the moniker Bloody Mary for her persecution of Protestants, with around 280 people executed by burning, including Cranmer, Ridley, and Latimer. Her foreign policy tied England to Habsburg interests, resulting in the loss of Calais in 1558, the last English possession in France, and a devastating blow to national pride. Mary's failure to produce an heir left her half-sister Elizabeth as her successor. She died on November 17, 1558, ending the Catholic Restoration. Elizabeth I's reign, 1558 to 1603, was transformative, ushering in what is often termed the Elizabethan era. Her first challenge was the settlement of religion. Through the Act of Supremacy, 1559, she restored the monarch's authority over the Church of England, this time styled as Supreme Governor rather than Supreme Head, a more acceptable title to moderate opinion. The Act of Uniformity, 1559, established a prayer book that blended Protestant doctrine with some traditional elements, creating a via media, or middle way, that defined Anglicanism. This Elizabethan settlement ensured relative religious stability, though Catholic plots and Puritan dissent persisted. Elizabeth's foreign policy balanced caution with assertiveness. She avoided marriage despite numerous suitors, leveraging her single status as a diplomatic tool. Relations with Spain deteriorated, exacerbated by England's support for Dutch rebels and privateering against Spanish treasure fleets. This culminated in the attempted Spanish Armada of 1588, a fleet of 130 ships launched by Philip II to invade England. The Armada was defeated through a combination of English naval tactics, use of fire ships, and adverse weather, cementing Elizabeth's prestige and England's naval reputation. The Elizabethan age also saw the beginnings of overseas expansion, with figures like Francis Drake circumnavigating the globe, 1577 to 1580, and Walter Raleigh attempting to Domestically, Elizabeth's reign was marked by relative stability, but also persistent challenges. The Northern Rebellion, 1569, the Ridolfi Plot, 1571, the Throckmorton Plot, 1583, and the Babington Plot, 1586, all sought to depose her in favor of Mary, Queen of Scots, who became a central figure in Catholic intrigue. Mary's execution in 1587, after nearly 2 decades of imprisonment, removed a focal point for conspiracies but heightened tensions with Spain. Elizabeth's government also managed economic and social strains, including inflation, poverty, and the need for poor relief, culminating in the Elizabethan Poor Laws that laid the foundations for social policy. Culturally, Elizabethan England witnessed a flourishing of the arts, with William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spenser, and others defining an enduring literary and theatrical legacy. Scientific inquiry and navigation also advanced, laying the groundwork for England's future role as a global power. By the time Elizabeth died on March 24, 1603, she had left no direct heir, ending the Tudor dynasty. The throne passed peacefully to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, inaugurating the Stuart era and uniting the crowns of England and Scotland under one monarch for the first time. This smooth transition marked the success of Elizabeth's cautious statecraft and the stability she had worked to maintain over 4 decades. In 1603, the death of Elizabeth I without an heir ended the Tudor dynasty and ushered in the rule of the Stuarts. James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and great-grandson of Henry VII, was invited to succeed as James I of England, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland. Though politically the two kingdoms remained separate, sharing a monarch forged a new dynastic link that set the stage for future union. James was crowned at Westminster on July 25, 1603, beginning the Stuart era. He pursued the vision of a single kingdom, even styling himself King of Great Britain, though Parliament resisted full union. James's reign witnessed relative peace abroad after he concluded the Treaty of London in 1604, ending England's long war with Spain. At home, he sought religious conformity, authorizing the 1611 King James Bible, which became one of the most enduring legacies of his rule. Yet tensions simmered beneath the surface. The Gunpowder Plot of 1605, in which Guy Fawkes and Catholic conspirators attempted to blow up Parliament and the king, exposed deep religious divisions and cemented anti-Catholic sentiment for generations. James's financial mismanagement and reliance on favorites like the Duke of Buckingham strained relations with Parliament. He survived his reign, dying on March 27, 1625, but his son, Charles I, inherited a kingdom already fractious. Charles married Henrietta Maria of France, a Catholic princess, in May 1625, fueling suspicions about his religious loyalties. His belief in the divine right of kings clashed sharply with Parliament's insistence on control over taxation. Dissolving Parliament multiple times, Charles ruled without it during the so-called personal rule from 1629 to 1640. During this period, he enforced unpopular taxes such as ship money and promoted Arminian religious policies through Archbishop William Laud, provoking widespread opposition. Resistance grew in Scotland after Charles attempted to impose the English prayer book in 1637, sparking the Bishops' Wars, 1639 to 1640. Defeated and financially desperate, Charles recalled Parliament in 1640. The short Parliament was quickly dismissed, but the Long Parliament, convened in November, resisted his authority, passing measures to curb royal power and impeaching his ministers. Tensions spiraled into open conflict. In January 1642, Charles entered the House of Commons with armed guards, attempting to arrest 5 leading MPs, but they had fled. This unprecedented breach of parliamentary privilege destroyed trust. By August 1642, England was at war. The English Civil War pitted royalists, or cavaliers, against parliamentarians, or roundheads. Early battles, such as Edgehill in October 1642, proved indecisive. Parliament, however, held advantages in resources and control of London. Under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell, who forged the disciplined New Model Army, Parliament gained momentum. At Marston Moor in July 1644, parliamentarian forces dealt a crushing blow to royalist hopes in the north. The decisive victory came at Naseby in June 1645, where Charles's army was shattered and his correspondence captured, revealing his appeals for foreign aid. Charles surrendered to the Scots in May 1646, effectively ending the first phase of the war. But negotiations failed. Charles's duplicity and secret agreements triggered the Second Civil War in 1648. Parliament, led by radicals in the New Model Army, suppressed uprisings and decisively defeated royalist forces at the Battle of Preston in August 1648. By December, the army purged Parliament in Pride's Purge, leaving a rump parliament to try the king. On January 30th, 1649, Charles I was executed outside the banqueting house in Whitehall, condemned as a tyrant, traitor, and public enemy. The monarchy was abolished, and England was declared a republic or commonwealth. Power lay with Parliament, but Cromwell and the army soon dominated. In 1649, Cromwell crushed rebellion in Ireland with brutal campaigns at Drogheda and Wexford, actions remembered for their severity. He also subdued Scotland, defeating Charles II, who had been proclaimed king there, at the Battle of Worcester in September 1651. With opposition defeated, Cromwell consolidated authority. In 1653, dissatisfied with Parliament, he dissolved it and became Lord Protector under the instrument of government, England's first written constitution. The Protectorate established a quasi-monarchical regime, with Cromwell ruling until his death on September 3, 1658. His son, Richard Cromwell, briefly succeeded him but lacked authority. By 1660, amid chaos and dissatisfaction, Parliament invited Charles II to return. The monarchy was restored, beginning the Stuart Restoration. Charles II entered London in triumph on May 29, 1660. The monarchy was back, but under new conditions. The king acknowledged the supremacy of Parliament and issued the Declaration of Breda, promising pardon, religious toleration, and respect for property. Yet his reign was marked by crises. The Great Plague of 1665 ravaged London, killing tens of thousands. The following year, the Great Fire of London in September 1666 destroyed much of the city, including St. Paul's Cathedral, though relatively few lives were lost. Wars with the Dutch, notably the Second Anglo-Dutch War, 1665 to 1667, strained resources and ended in humiliation with the Dutch raid on the Medway in 1667. Charles's secret Treaty of Dover in 1670 with Louis XIV of France, which included promises of subsidies and even his conversion to Catholicism, deepened distrust. The 1670s and 1680s saw the exclusion crisis, as Parliament sought to bar Charles's Catholic brother James, Duke of York, from the throne. Political factions solidified into Whigs, who opposed succession by a Catholic, and Tories, who supported the hereditary right. Charles dissolved Parliament and ruled without it from 1681 until his death on February 6, 1685, converting to Catholicism on his deathbed. James II succeeded and immediately alarmed the Protestant establishment. Openly Catholic, he pursued policies of religious toleration for Catholics and dissenters, issuing the Declaration of Indulgence in 1687 and 1688. He appointed Catholics to high office and maintained a standing army commanded by Catholic officers, fueling fears of absolutism. The birth of his son, James Francis Edward Stuart, on June 10, 1688, created the prospect of a Catholic dynasty, galvanizing opposition. Leading nobles invited William of Orange, husband of James's Protestant daughter Mary, to intervene. William landed at Torbay on November 5, 1688, with a Dutch force. James's support collapsed. He fled to France in December. This glorious revolution ended his reign without major bloodshed in England, though conflict raged in Scotland and Ireland. William and Mary accepted the crown in 1689, agreeing to the Bill of Rights, which enshrined parliamentary supremacy, regular elections, and limits on royal power. The Toleration Act of 1689 granted freedom of worship to Protestant dissenters, though Catholics and Unitarians remained excluded. In Scotland, the Revolution established Presbyterianism as the national church, while in Ireland, war followed. William defeated James's forces at the Battle of the Boyne on July 1, 1690, Old Style, and resistance ended with the Treaty of Limerick in 1691. These conflicts reinforced Protestant ascendancy and linked the English monarchy to parliamentary consent. The later Stuart years saw further settlement of constitutional issues. After Mary died in 1694, William ruled alone until his own death in 1702. Parliament had already passed the Bill of Rights and later the Act of Settlement in 1701, which excluded Catholics from the succession and designated the Protestant House of Hanover as heirs if William and Mary's line failed. This law ensured that the monarchy would remain Protestant, shaping the future course of the kingdom. Thus, by the dawn of the 18th century, the Stuart era had transformed England. Civil war, regicide, Republican experiment, restoration, and revolution had reshaped the balance between monarchy and parliament. Religious strife remained, but a constitutional monarchy was now established, paving the way for the union of England and Scotland and the emergence of Great Britain. The death of William III on March 8, 1702, without heirs brought his sister-in-law, and the younger daughter of James II, to the throne, and had endured a life of personal tragedy, suffering multiple stillbirths and the death of her only surviving child, William, Duke of Gloucester, in 1700 at the age of 11. With her accession, the Stuart line moved closer to extinction, a reality that made securing the Protestant succession a pressing political concern. Parliament had already passed the Act of Settlement in 1701, stipulating that if and inherited a kingdom embroiled in continental war. In 1701, England had joined the Grand Alliance against France and Spain to prevent the Bourbon monarchy from dominating Europe. This War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, became the defining conflict of her reign. Under the command of John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, Allied armies achieved a series of spectacular victories. At the Battle of Blenheim on August 13, 1704, Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy dealt a crushing blow to French ambitions. Further triumphs followed at Ramillies in May 1706, Oudenarde in July 1708, and Malplaquet in September 1709. These victories established Britain as a major European power, though the war placed immense strain on finances and manpower. At home, Anne's reign saw increasing political polarization between Whigs and Tories. The Whigs favored aggressive prosecution of the war, Protestant succession, and financial innovation through the Bank of England, founded in 1694. The Tories were more skeptical of continental entanglements and more inclined toward traditional Anglicanism. And herself leaned Tory, but the demands of war forced her to rely on Whig ministers, particularly after 1708. The interplay between the Crown and emerging party politics marked an important development in the evolution of parliamentary government. The most significant constitutional achievement of Anne's reign was the union of England and Scotland. The two kingdoms had shared a monarch since 1603, but remained legally and institutionally distinct. Tensions often flared, particularly during the Wars of the Three Kingdoms in the 17th century. By the early 18th century, economic hardship in Scotland, especially after the catastrophic failure of the Darien Scheme, 1698 to 1700, and fears of succession disputes pushed both sides toward formal union. English leaders, wary of a Catholic Stuart restoration in Scotland, sought to secure the succession under the Hanoverians. Negotiations culminated in the Acts of Union, passed by both the English and Scottish parliaments in 1707. On May 1, 1707, the Kingdom of Great Britain came into being, uniting the two parliaments and creating a single state with one sovereign, one legislature, and a shared economic space. Scotland retained its separate legal and church systems, but gained representation at Westminster, and opened the first Parliament of Great Britain on October 23, 1707. The new kingdom faced immediate challenges. Jacobite sentiment remained strong in Scotland, and in 1708, a French fleet attempted to land James Francis Edward Stuart, the Old Pretender, on Scottish soil. The invasion failed, but it underscored the fragility of the Union. Meanwhile, discontent with the protracted War of the Spanish Succession deepened at home. By 1710, the Tories regained dominance, forming a government under Robert Harley and Henry St. John, Viscount Bolingbroke. They negotiated the Treaty of Utrecht, signed in April 1713, which ended the war. Britain emerged with significant gains. Gibraltar and Minorca in the Mediterranean, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and Hudson Bay territories in North America, and the lucrative Asiento contract granting Britain the right to supply slaves to Spanish America. These acquisitions marked the beginning of Britain's rise as a global empire. Anne's final years were marked by ill health and factional intrigue. With no surviving children, the succession loomed large. On August 1, 1714, she died at Kensington Palace. Sophia of Hanover had predeceased her in June, so the crown passed to Sophia's son, George, Elector of Hanover, who became George I. Thus began the Hanoverian dynasty, fulfilling the provisions of the Act of Settlement and cementing the exclusion of the Catholic Stuarts. George I's accession was not universally accepted. The Jacobite Rising of 1715, known as the 15, attempted to restore James Francis Edward Stuart. The Earl of Mar raised the standard at Braemar in Scotland on September 6, 1715, gathering support in the Highlands. Battles at Sheriffmuir on November 13th and the capture of Preston in England showed Jacobite strength, but ended indecisively. James himself arrived in Scotland in December, but, facing dwindling support, fled in February 1716. The rebellion collapsed, but Jacobitism remained a potent force for decades. The early Hanoverian period entrenched parliamentary supremacy. George I, unfamiliar with English politics and the language itself, relied heavily on ministers. The office of the Prime Minister began to take shape under Sir Robert Walpole, who dominated government from 1721 to 1742. Walpole's long tenure reflected stability and the growing importance of the cabinet system, accountable to Parliament rather than to the monarch alone. The Jacobite threat returned in the 45 Rising, the most serious attempt to restore the Stuarts. In July 1745, Charles Edward Stuart, the Young Pretender, or Bonnie Prince Charlie, landed in Scotland. Gathering Highland support, he captured Edinburgh and won a stunning victory at the Battle of Prestonpans on September 21st. The Jacobites advanced deep into England, reaching Derby by December 4th, but support failed to materialize. Retreating north, they were decisively defeated by the Duke of Cumberland at the Battle of Culloden on April 16, 1746. The aftermath was brutal. Highland culture was suppressed, clans disarmed, and Jacobite leaders executed or exiled. The failure of the 45 ended serious Stuart hopes of restoration. Alongside dynastic struggles, Britain expanded overseas. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 had already established footholds, but the 18th century saw further consolidation. The War of Jenkins' Ear, 1739 to 1748, and the War of the Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748, extended Britain's reach, particularly in the Caribbean and India. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, marked a decisive turning point. Britain, under leaders such as William Pitt the Elder, secured global supremacy. Victories at Plassey in India in 1757 and Quebec in 1759 gave Britain control over vast territories. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 confirmed Britain's dominance in North America and India, laying the foundation for the world's most extensive empire. At home, economic and cultural transformation accompanied military and imperial expansion. Agricultural innovations, the enclosure movement, crop rotation, and selective breeding boosted productivity. The population grew, literacy increased, and the press flourished. The 1707 Union also opened English markets to Scottish trade, fueling prosperity and integration. London emerged as a financial center, aided by institutions like the Bank of England and the South Sea Company, though the South Sea bubble of 1720 revealed the risks of speculation. By the mid-18th century, the Kingdom of Great Britain was firmly established, with a parliamentary monarchy entrenched, Jacobite challenges defeated, and imperial foundations laid. The state created in 1707 had not only survived its early tests, but had begun to project power across the globe. From the War of the Spanish Succession to the 7 Years' War, from the Acts of Union to Culloden, the early 18th century transformed Britain into a formidable European and global force. The mid-18th century marked a defining chapter in the history of the United Kingdom, as the nation transitioned from a European power to the world's preeminent empire. The 7 Years' War, fought from 1756 to 1763, was the first truly global conflict, and Britain emerged as its principal victor. Under the leadership of William Pitt the Elder, Britain prioritized naval supremacy and the targeting of French colonial possessions. In India, Robert Clive's victory at the Battle of Plassey on June 23, 1757, aided by the defection of Mir Jafar, secured Bengal, the richest province of the Mughal Empire. This triumph laid the foundation for British dominance in India through the East India Company formalized by the Treaty of Paris on February 10, 1763, which granted Britain vast territories in North America, including Canada, and confirmed its supremacy in India. At the same time, victories such as Admiral Hawke's defeat of the French fleet at Quiberon Bay on November 20, 1759 ensured naval control, cementing Britain's status as the world's leading maritime power. However, victory came at a price. The war's immense costs burdened the British state with debt, leading to the expansion of taxation and new financial schemes. Efforts to extract revenue from the American colonies, beginning with the Sugar Act of 1764 and the Stamp Act of 1765, provoked resistance. Colonists insisted on the principle of no taxation without representation, arguing that only their own assemblies had the right to levy taxes. British attempts to assert authority, including the Townshend Acts of 1767 and the Tea Act of 1773, met with protests, culminating in the Boston Tea Party of December 16, 1773. The crisis escalated into armed conflict at Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775, beginning the American Revolutionary War. Initially, Britain appeared poised to suppress the rebellion. The capture of New York in 1776 and Philadelphia in 1777 demonstrated British military strength. Yet the war shifted after the American victory at Saratoga on October 17, 1777, which convinced France to ally with the colonies in 1778. Spain joined in 1779 and the Dutch in 1780, transforming the conflict into a global war. Britain's overstretched military faced setbacks not only in America, but also in the Caribbean, Africa, and India. The decisive blow came at Yorktown, Virginia, where General Charles Cornwallis surrendered to Franco-American forces on October 19, 1781. Peace negotiations followed, and the Treaty of Paris, signed on September 3, 1783, recognized the independence of the United States. Britain retained Canada, the Caribbean colonies, and India, but the loss of the 13 colonies marked the end of the First British Empire. Paradoxically, defeat in America spurred Britain to refocus on Asia, the Pacific, and Africa. The East India Company expanded its influence in India, particularly after Warren Hastings became Governor-General in 1773. The Regulating Act of 1773 and the India Act of 1784 established parliamentary oversight, marking the beginning of direct state involvement in imperial governance. In Australia, the first fleet arrived at Botany Bay on January 26, 1788, establishing a penal colony and opening a new phase of colonial expansion. In Africa and the Caribbean, Britain consolidated its role in the transatlantic slave trade, though criticism grew from figures such as William Wilberforce and the Clapham sect, who began the abolitionist movement in the 1780s. Domestically, the late 18th century was a period of rapid social and political change. The Gordon Riots of June 1780, fueled by opposition to Catholic relief, exposed tensions within society. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain during this period, fundamentally altered the economy and landscape. Innovations such as James Watt's steam engine, patented in 1769, and Richard Arkwright's water frame, 1769, revolutionized manufacturing, while the enclosure movement transformed agriculture, displacing rural populations and fueling urbanization. Cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Glasgow expanded rapidly, becoming centers of industry and labor. Politically, the reign of George III, who had ascended the throne on October 25, 1760, was marked by both stability and turmoil. His long reign saw the strengthening of parliamentary government, though controversies, such as John Wilkes's radical campaigns in the 1760s, revealed popular demands for reform. The king's bouts of mental illness, particularly after 1788, complicated governance and culminated in the Regency Act of 1811, placing power in the hands of his son, the future George IV. The French Revolution, beginning in 1789, presented Britain with both ideological and military challenges. At first, British opinion was divided. Reformers like Thomas Paine celebrated revolutionary ideals in his Rights of Man, 1791 to 1792, while conservatives, led by Edmund Burke, warned of chaos in his Reflections on the Revolution in France, 1790. After the execution of Louis XVI on January 21, 1793, Britain joined the First Coalition against France, entering a period of nearly continuous conflict that lasted until 1815. The wars against revolutionary and later Napoleonic France became the crucible in which modern Britain was forged. At sea, Britain's naval dominance proved decisive. Admiral Horatio Nelson's victories, especially the Battle of the Nile on August 1, 1798, and Trafalgar on October 21, 1805, ensured that French ambitions to challenge British control of the seas were thwarted. On land, British involvement on the continent was more limited, but the Peninsular War, 1808–1814, led by Arthur Wellesley, later Duke of Wellington, played a crucial role in weakening Napoleon's forces. Domestically, the war years were marked by hardship, food shortages, and calls for reform. Yet Britain also experienced a surge in industrial output, enabling it to finance coalitions against France. The abolitionist movement achieved a major victory with the passing of the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act on March 25, 1807, though slavery itself would not be abolished in the British Empire until 1833. Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo on June 18, 1815 secured Britain's position as the leading world power. The Congress of Vienna, 1814–1815, restored European stability, but Britain emerged uniquely advantaged with a vast empire, unparalleled naval strength, and the beginnings of industrial supremacy. By the early 19th century, the United Kingdom had undergone a profound transformation. From the loss of the American colonies to the conquest of India, from the Industrial Revolution to the defeat of Napoleon, Britain had redefined itself as a global empire and the world's foremost economic power. The transition from the 18th to the 19th century thus represented not decline, but reinvention, laying the groundwork for the Victorian era when Britain would stand at the zenith of its influence. The reign of Queen Victoria, from June 20th, 1837 until her death on January 22, 1901, marked one of the most significant epochs in the history of the United Kingdom. Lasting more than 63 years, the Victorian era was a period of industrial, cultural, political, and imperial transformation that established Britain as the leading global power of the 19th century. The coronation of Victoria in Westminster Abbey on June 28, 1838, symbolized both continuity and renewal, as the young queen embodied a new generation, following the turbulent reigns of her uncles, George IV, 1820–1830, and William IV, 1830–1837. At the same time, Britain was transforming unprecedented scale as industrialization and empire expanded the nation's reach and influence. Industrial progress defined the early decades of Victoria's reign. The railway boom of the 1830s and 1840s, led by engineers such as Isambard Kingdom Brunel and George Stephenson, connected cities and industrial centers, facilitating trade and mobility. The opening of the Great Western Railway between London and Bristol in 1838 and the Liverpool and Manchester Railway earlier in 1830 exemplified the speed of progress. Steam power revolutionized transport and manufacturing, while coal and iron fueled Britain's dominance. Cities like Manchester became synonymous with textile production, while Birmingham became a hub of metalworking. By mid-century, Britain produced more than half the world's coal and iron, and its textile industry dominated global markets. Social change followed industrial expansion. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, which preceded Victoria's reign, remained contentious, as workhouses symbolized the harshness of Victorian social policy. The Chartist movement of the 1830s and 1840s demanded universal male suffrage, secret ballots, and parliamentary reform, culminating in petitions to Parliament in 1839 1842, and 1848. Though rejected at the time, Chartism highlighted the growing pressure for political inclusion. Reform continued gradually, with the Reform Act of 1867 extending the vote to many urban working men and the Ballot Act of 1872 introducing secret voting. By the Representation of the People Act of 1884, the franchise had expanded further, though women remained excluded until the 20th century. The monarchy itself transformed during Victoria's reign. Her marriage to Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha on February 10, 1840 set the tone for a new royal image: domestic, moral, and bourgeois. Albert became an influential advisor, championing science, education, and industry. The Great Exhibition of 1851, housed in Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, celebrated Britain's industrial achievements and global influence. Attended by more than 6 million visitors, it symbolized the marriage of empire, industry, and monarchy. Albert's death on December 14, 1861 deeply affected Victoria, who entered a prolonged period of mourning, withdrawing from public life and relying heavily on ministers like Lord Melbourne and later Benjamin Disraeli. The political landscape was dominated by the rivalry between the Conservative and Liberal parties, personified by Disraeli and William Ewart Gladstone. Disraeli, twice Prime Minister, 1868, 1874 to 1880, emphasized empire, monarchy, and national prestige. His Second Reform Act of 1867 extended suffrage, while his imperial policies culminated in the purchase of Suez Canal shares in 1875 and the proclamation of Victoria as Empress of India on January 1, 1877. Gladstone, Prime Minister 4 times between 1868 and 1894, pursued reforms emphasizing efficiency, morality, and Irish Home Rule. His government passed measures such as the Education Act of 1870, which created elementary schools, and the Ballot Act of 1872. The contest between Disraeli's imperial conservatism and Gladstone's moral liberalism defined much of Victorian politics. The Victorian era was also shaped by major crises abroad. The Irish famine of 1845 to 1852 devastated Ireland, caused by potato blight, Phytophthora infestans, leading to over 1 million deaths and mass immigration, especially to the United States. British relief efforts were widely criticized as inadequate, and the famine left a deep scar on Anglo-Irish relations. In India, the Indian Rebellion of 1857, sparked by discontent within the Bengal Army, challenged the East India Company's rule. Following the suppression of the uprising in 1858, the British Crown assumed direct control of India, inaugurating the British Raj under the Government of India Act of August 2, 1858. Militarily, Britain fought a series of wars that tested its power and expanded its empire. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, fought alongside France, Sardinia, and the Ottoman Empire against Russia, was notable for the Siege of Sevastopol and the Battle of Balaclava on October 25, 1854, which produced the famed Charge of the Light Brigade. The war highlighted both the inefficiencies of the British military and the importance of modern nursing, pioneered by Florence Nightingale. Later conflicts, such as the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879 and the First Boer War of 1880 to 1881, revealed the challenges of empire, while the Second Boer War, 1899 to 1902, beginning in Victoria's final years, foreshadowed the brutal colonial conflicts of the 20th century. Empire defined Britain's global role. By the mid-19th century, Britain controlled vast territories across Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. The abolition of slavery in the British Empire in 1833, implemented from 1834, transformed labor systems in colonies, though indentured servitude, particularly from India, replaced slavery in many regions. The scramble for Africa in the 1880s and 1890s expanded British influence, culminating in control of vast territories from Egypt to South Africa. Britain's informal empire through trade and finance extended its influence even where direct rule was absent. Scientific and cultural achievements paralleled imperial expansion. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, published on November 24, 1859, revolutionized biology, while Michael Faraday and James Clerk Maxwell advanced physics. Literature flourished, with writers such as Charles Dickens, the Bronte sisters, Thomas Hardy, and George Eliot capturing the complexities of Victorian society. Alfred, Lord Tennyson, as poet laureate, expressed both the grandeur and anxieties of the age. Architecture reflected revivalist styles, from Gothic to neoclassical, with landmarks like the Houses of Parliament, completed in the 1860s, symbolizing national pride. The era also witnessed significant social reform. The Public Health Acts of 1848 and 1875 addressed the sanitation crises of rapidly growing cities, while the Factory Acts, 1833, 1844, 1878, improved conditions for workers, especially women and children. Trade unions gained legal recognition with the Trade Union Act of 1871, giving organized labor a political voice. The rise of the Labor Representation Committee in 1900, shortly before Victoria's death, signaled the growing role of labor politics. Religion and morality played central roles in Victorian identity. The Oxford movement of the 1830s and 1840s, led by figures like John Henry Newman, sought to revive Catholic traditions within the Anglican Church. Evangelicalism, emphasizing personal morality and missionary zeal, influenced both domestic policy and imperial expansion. Missionary societies spread Christianity across Africa and Asia, intertwining faith with empire. At the same time, secularism and scientific inquiry challenged traditional beliefs, creating tensions between science and religion. By the end of Victoria's reign in 1901, Britain had been transformed. The population had doubled, cities had become industrial giants, the empire had reached its zenith, and British culture had left an indelible mark on the world. Yet beneath the grandeur lay contradictions. Prosperity coexisted with poverty, reform with inequality, empire with resistance. Victoria herself, once a symbol of youthful promise, had become the embodiment of tradition and continuity. Her funeral on February 2, 1901 marked not just the passing of a monarch, but the end of an era that had defined Britain's place in the world. The 20th century tested the resilience of the United Kingdom in ways that reshaped its identity, both at home and abroad. The First World War, breaking out in August 1914, marked the first great rupture. Britain, bound by treaty obligations and a sense of maintaining balance in Europe, declared war on Germany on August 4, 1914, after German troops violated Belgian neutrality. The war mobilized millions. By 1918, over 8.7 million men had served in the British Army, including volunteers from across the Empire, Canada, Australia, India, South Africa, and New Zealand. Industrial mobilization transformed society, drawing women into factories and changing class dynamics. Yet the price was staggering. More than 700,000 British soldiers died, and countless others returned with wounds, visible and invisible. The Battle of the Somme, won July 18, November 1916, alone saw over 57,000 British casualties on the first day, the bloodiest in British military history. By the war's end, victory had been achieved, but Britain emerged economically weakened, heavily indebted to the United States, and facing unrest at home. The interwar years, 1919 to 1939, reflected both triumph and turbulence. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, redrew Europe's borders, and Britain gained new territories under League of Nations mandates, including Palestine and Mesopotamia, later Iraq. Yet at home, strikes and labor unrest signaled discontent, culminating in the General Strike of May 1926, when millions of workers halted industry in solidarity with miners. Political change was also evident. The Representation of the People Act of 1918 granted voting rights to all men over 21 and women over 30, expanding the electorate by millions. By 1928, with the Equal Franchise Act, women gained voting rights on the same terms as men, cementing Britain's path toward universal suffrage. These changes, however, coincided with economic difficulties. The Wall Street crash of October 1929 triggered a worldwide depression that left millions unemployed in Britain, especially in industrial regions such as South Wales, the north of England, and Scotland. Yet despite hardship, the 1930s also witnessed cultural and technological dynamism. The BBC, founded in 1922, became a national institution. Radar technology was developed, and British literature and film flourished. The rise of fascism in Europe soon forced Britain to confront another existential threat. Adolf Hitler's ascension to power in 1933 in Germany's rearmament placed pressure on Britain's leaders, who initially pursued appeasement. The Munich Agreement of September 30, 1938, where Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain sought peace for our time, temporarily delayed conflict but emboldened Nazi ambitions. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, Britain honored its guarantee to Poland, declaring war on September 3. Thus began the Second World War, the greatest trial in Britain's modern history. The early years were grim. In 1940, following the fall of France in June, Britain stood virtually alone in Europe against Nazi Germany. Winston Churchill, becoming Prime Minister on May 10, 1940, rallied the nation with speeches that combined resolve and realism, declaring, "We shall fight on the beaches." The Battle of Britain, fought from July to October 1940, tested the Royal Air Force against the Luftwaffe. Radar, innovative tactics, and sheer resilience gave Britain victory, preventing invasion. Yet the Blitz, beginning with the bombing of London on September 7, 1940, and continuing until May 1941, devastated cities, killing over 43,000 civilians. Despite this, morale endured, symbolized by King George VI and Queen Elizabeth's visits to bombed areas and the stoicism of Londoners sheltering in underground stations. From 1941, the war's scope widened. Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 and Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 brought powerful allies into the conflict. Britain became a vital base for Allied planning, from the North African campaigns under Montgomery to the D-Day landings of June 6, 1944, when British, American, and Canadian troops stormed Normandy's beaches. By May 1945, Germany surrendered, and Europe celebrated victory in Europe Day on May 8. Yet Britain's triumph was bittersweet. The war had cost the lives of over 450,000 Britons, and the economy was drained, leaving the country reliant on American loans. The war also accelerated the dissolution of the empire. India, long the jewel of the British Empire, gained independence on August 15, 1947, followed by the partition that created Pakistan. This moment signaled the beginning of decolonization, a process that would unfold across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean in the following decades. Britain sought to maintain influence through the Commonwealth, but the imperial age had entered irreversible decline. At home, the war's end ushered in a new political era. In the 1945 general election, Clement Attlee's Labour Party achieved a landslide victory, defeating Churchill. Labour embarked on sweeping reforms. The National Health Service, launched in 1948 under Health Minister Aneurin Bevan, promised free health care for all, while nationalization of key industries sought to rebuild the economy. These changes laid the foundation of the modern welfare state, even as Britain faced austerity, food rationing, and ongoing reconstruction. The post-war years also brought new challenges of identity and migration. The arrival of the Empire Windrush on June 22, 1948, carrying Caribbean migrants to Britain, marked the beginning of a new multicultural phase. These communities, along with later migrants from South Asia and Africa, would play vital roles in Britain's economy and culture, even as their presence sparked debates about race, integration, and belonging. The Suez Crisis of 1956, when Britain and France attempted to seize control of the Suez Canal after its nationalization by Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, exposed the limits of Britain's global power. American and Soviet pressure forced a humiliating withdrawal, signaling that Britain was no longer a superpower. Meanwhile, Britain's relationship with Europe grew increasingly significant. After initial hesitation, Britain joined the European Economic Community in 1973 under Conservative Prime Minister Edward Heath, though this relationship remained contentious for decades. Domestically, the 1970s brought economic turmoil, with strikes, inflation, and the winter of discontent of 1978 to 79 paving the way for Margaret Thatcher's rise to power in 1979. Thatcher's policies of deregulation, privatization, and confrontation with trade unions reshaped the economy and society, even as they polarized opinion. The 1980s were also marked by conflict and transformation. The Falklands War of 1982 saw Britain defend its overseas territory from Argentine invasion, reaffirming military resolve. Yet at home, deindustrialization left deep scars in mining and manufacturing communities. Simultaneously, British culture thrived on the global stage, with music, fashion, and television influencing worldwide trends. By the 1990s, under John Major and later Tony Blair, Britain embraced modernization, from the peace process in Northern Ireland, culminating in the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, to Blair's emphasis on a new Labour identity. The 20th century thus left Britain profoundly changed. From imperial power to welfare state, from wartime endurance to post-war decline, and reinvention, the United Kingdom navigated wars, decolonization, and cultural transformation. Its resilience lay in adaptation, balancing tradition with change, and confronting both triumphs and failures with determination. The dawn of the 21st century ushered the United Kingdom into an era of transformation and challenge, shaped by globalization, geopolitics, and internal divisions. In 1997, Tony Blair's Labour Party had secured a landslide victory, promising a new Labour vision that modernized social democracy. Blair's government introduced constitutional reforms that altered the structure of governance. Devolution reshaped the political landscape. In 1998, referendums led to the establishment of the Scottish Parliament. And Welsh Assembly, inaugurated in 1999, granting both nations significant autonomy over domestic affairs. Northern Ireland, long scarred by sectarian violence known as the Troubles, saw progress with the Good Friday Agreement signed on April 10, 1998, brokered by Blair and Irish Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, alongside U.S. mediation. This landmark peace accord created a power-sharing government between Unionists and Nationalists, reducing violence after decades of conflict that had claimed over 3,500 lives since the late 1960s. Blair's Britain embraced a proactive global role. After the 9/11 attacks on the United States in September 2001, The UK became America's closest ally in the War on Terror. British forces joined the invasion of Afghanistan in October 2001, aiming to dismantle al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban. More controversially, Blair committed Britain to the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq in March 2003, based on claims that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. The war, though militarily successful in ousting Hussein, grew increasingly unpopular as no such weapons were found, and the conflict dragged on as a violent insurgency. By 2006, public disillusionment with Blair deepened, tarnishing his premiership and fueling debates about Britain's foreign policy alignment with Washington. Blair resigned in June 2007, handing power to Gordon Brown, his long-serving Chancellor of the Exchequer. At home, Brown faced a formidable challenge. The global financial crisis of 2007 to 2008 struck Britain hard, as banks such as Northern Rock collapsed, requiring state intervention. In October 2008, the government nationalized several banks and injected billions to stabilize the system, actions that increased public debt but prevented wider collapse. The crisis ushered in an era of austerity and recession. By the 2010 general election, public confidence in Labour had eroded, leading to a hung parliament. The Conservatives, led by David Cameron, formed a coalition with the Liberal Democrats under Nick Clegg, the first coalition government since 1945. Cameron's government prioritized austerity, implementing sweeping cuts to public spending from 2010 onward. These measures aimed to reduce the budget deficit, but triggered controversy over their social impact, as libraries, community services, and welfare support contracted. Simultaneously, constitutional questions resurfaced. In 2014, Scotland held an independence referendum on September 18, with 55% voting to remain in the United Kingdom against 45% seeking independence. The result preserved the Union but exposed deep divisions as the Scottish National Party, SNP, continued to grow in influence. Meanwhile, Britain's relationship with the European Union remained contentious. Rising concerns over sovereignty, immigration, and EU regulations fueled Euroscepticism, particularly within the Conservative Party. To quell internal divisions and challenge the UK Independence Party's growing influence, Cameron promised a referendum on EU membership. The vote took place on June 23, 2016. In a shock result, 51.9% voted to leave the European Union against 48.1% to remain. The Brexit decision revealed sharp divides. Scotland and Northern Ireland voted strongly to remain, while England and Wales favored leaving. The result triggered Cameron's resignation, replaced by Theresa May in July 2016. May sought to deliver Brexit, invoking Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty on March 29, 2017, formally beginning the withdrawal process. Yet negotiations with Brussels proved fraught, with disputes over trade, customs, and the Irish border. The backstop issue, aimed at preventing a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, became the most contentious obstacle. May's proposed deal faced repeated rejection in Parliament, culminating in her resignation in June 2019. Boris Johnson succeeded her, promising to get Brexit done. After a decisive Conservative victory in the December 2019 general election, Johnson pushed through the withdrawal agreement, and Britain formally left the European Union on January 31, 2020, ending nearly 5 decades of membership. Barely had Brexit taken effect when the COVID-19 pandemic struck. The first confirmed cases in Britain emerged in January 2020, and by March, the government imposed nationwide lockdowns. Schools closed, businesses shuttered, and the National Health Service faced unprecedented strain. Over 200,000 people in the UK ultimately died from COVID-19 related causes, one of the highest tolls in Europe. The government launched furlough schemes to protect jobs and rolled out vaccines at scale by late 2020. But Johnson's leadership faced criticism over delays and lockdowns, shortages of protective equipment, and revelations of breaches of lockdown rules by officials. The so-called Partygate scandal eroded public trust, contributing to Johnson's resignation in July 2022. Johnson was succeeded by Liz Truss in September 2022, but her premiership lasted only 49 days, the shortest in British history. Her mini-budget, announced on September 23, 2022, proposed sweeping tax cuts without sufficient fiscal backing, triggering market turmoil and a collapse in the pound's value. Political chaos ensued, and she resigned in October. Rishi Sunak, former chancellor, became prime minister, seeking to restore stability amid inflation, strikes, and economic pressures stemming from Brexit, the pandemic, and the global energy crisis intensified by Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Britain supplied weapons and aid to Ukraine, reaffirming its role in European security despite no longer being part of the EU. Throughout the early 21st century, debates over identity, sovereignty, and the Union persisted. In Scotland, calls for a second independence referendum intensified, particularly after Brexit, since Scotland had voted 62% to remain in the EU. In Northern Ireland, Brexit complicated the peace settlement, as the Northern Ireland Protocol created new trade barriers between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Political tensions resurfaced, raising questions about the durability of the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. England and Wales, meanwhile, grappled with regional inequalities, immigration debates, and cultural shifts. The monarchy also experienced profound change. Queen Elizabeth II, who had reigned since 1952, became the longest-serving monarch in British history, celebrating her Platinum Jubilee in June 2022. Yet her death on September 8, 2022 ended an era, triggering widespread mourning across the UK and Commonwealth. Her son ascended the throne as Charles III, symbolizing continuity amid uncertainty. The monarchy, while still a unifying symbol, faced scrutiny in an age of modern democracy and economic hardship. Culturally, Britain continued to exert global influence in music, fashion, film, and literature, from the global success of artists like Adele and Ed Sheeran to the worldwide popularity of franchises such as Harry Potter and James Bond. London remained a financial hub, though Brexit and global competition tested its dominance. Social movements around climate change, gender equality, and racial justice gained prominence, reflecting generational shifts. By the early 2020s, the United Kingdom stood at a crossroads. Its imperial legacy had long receded, replaced by debates over national identity, global role, and internal unity. Yet despite political upheaval, economic turbulence, and shifting alliances, the UK continued to adapt, reflecting a history marked by resilience, reinvention, and the capacity to endure change while grappling with its past. The middle of the 20th century marked one of the most profound transformations in the history of the United Kingdom. By the late 1940s, the British Empire, once the largest in the world, began to unravel at a pace that few had anticipated. The Second World War had drained Britain financially, militarily, and psychologically. The United States and the Soviet Union had emerged as superpowers, while Britain, despite being a victor in 1945, entered the post-war era heavily indebted and dependent on American loans. The empire that had once stretched across continents now faced the inevitability of decolonization. India, often described as the jewel in the crown, was the first great loss. After years of nationalist agitation led by the Indian National Congress under Jawaharlal Nehru and the Muslim League under Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Britain agreed to withdraw. On August 15, 1947, India and Pakistan were granted independence, partitioning the subcontinent into two dominions. The event was accompanied by communal violence and mass migrations that claimed perhaps 1 million lives, and it marked the symbolic beginning of the end of the empire. Burma, Myanmar, followed in January 1948, and Ceylon, Sri Lanka, in February the same year. Palestine, under British mandate since 1920, became another flashpoint. In May 1948, Britain withdrew, and the State of Israel was proclaimed, igniting long-term regional conflict. At home, Clement Attlee's Labour government, 1945 to 1951, presided over reconstruction and introduced transformative domestic reforms. In 1948, the decades that followed witnessed a steady retreat from empire, a process Harold Macmillan, conservative prime minister from 1957 to 1963, called the Wind of Change. On February 3, 1960, he delivered his famous Wind of Change speech in Cape Town, acknowledging the rise of African nationalism. Ghana had already become the first sub-Saharan African colony to achieve independence in 1957 under Kwame Nkrumah. Nigeria gained independence in 1960, followed by Sierra Leone in 1961, Uganda in 1962, Kenya in 1963, and a wave of decolonization across the continent throughout the 1960s. Cyprus achieved independence in 1960, while Aden, later South Yemen, was relinquished in 1967. By the 1970s, Britain had surrendered nearly all of its major colonies, retaining only smaller overseas territories such as Gibraltar, Bermuda, and the Falkland Islands. Yet Britain did not withdraw from the global stage. Instead, it sought to redefine its role through the Commonwealth, a voluntary association of former colonies and dominions. The modern Commonwealth was formally established by the London Declaration of April 26, 1949, which allowed republics like India to remain members. Over time, it grew into an organization of over 50 nations, bound less by politics than by shared history, language, and institutions. The Queen became a symbolic head of the Commonwealth, strengthening Britain's cultural influence even as its empire vanished. Meanwhile, Britain grappled with questions of European integration. Initially skeptical, it applied to join the European Economic Community (EC) in 1961 under Macmillan, only to be vetoed by French President Charles de Gaulle. A second application in 1967 under Harold Wilson was again rejected. Only after de Gaulle left office did Britain finally succeed, joining the EEC on January 1, 1973 under Edward Heath's Conservative government. The move divided public opinion, with many seeing it as a pragmatic step to bolster trade and influence, while others lamented the erosion of sovereignty. A referendum held on June 5, 1975 confirmed Britain's membership, with 67% voting to remain. Domestically, the post-war decades saw major social and cultural transformations. Immigration reshaped society. The arrival of the Empire Windrush at Tilbury Docks on June 22, 1948, carrying passengers from the Caribbean, symbolized the beginning of large-scale migration from former colonies. By the 1950s and 1960s, communities from Jamaica, India, Pakistan, and later Africa settled in Britain, filling labor shortages but also sparking racial tensions. Riots in Notting Hill in 1958 and the rise of far-right groups underscored these tensions, while landmark legislation such as the Race Relations Acts of 1965 and 1968 attempted to combat discrimination. The multicultural Britain that emerged from this period became one of the most significant legacies of the imperial past. Politically, Britain oscillated between conservative and Labour governments, reflecting deep divides over economic management, industry, and welfare. The 1970s were especially turbulent, with rising unemployment, inflation, and industrial unrest. The Winter of Discontent in 1978 to 79 saw widespread strikes, undermining James Callaghan's Labour government and paving the way for Margaret Thatcher's conservative victory in May 1979. Though Thatcher's era belongs to a later chapter, her ascent marked the culmination of the post-imperial decades, Britain turning inward, grappling with its diminished global role, while seeking new forms of power in finance, culture, and diplomacy. Throughout this era, Northern Ireland became the site of the UK's most persistent internal crisis. The Troubles erupted in the late 1960s, rooted in disputes between the mainly Protestant Unionist community, favoring union with Britain, and the largely Catholic nationalist minority, seeking unification with the Republic of Ireland. The deployment of British troops in 1969 escalated the conflict, leading to decades of violence involving the Irish Republican Army, IRA, Loyalist paramilitaries, and British forces. A defining moment came on January 30th, 1972, Bloody Sunday, when British soldiers shot dead 13 unarmed civil rights marchers in Derry. The Troubles claimed thousands of lives and strained Britain's domestic politics and international image. Despite these challenges, Britain's cultural influence flourished. The 1960s saw the rise of swinging London, with music, fashion, and youth culture dominating global trends. Bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, designers like Mary Quant, and institutions like the BBC carried British culture worldwide. Literature, from George Orwell to Doris Lessing, and cinema, from James Bond to Monty Python, projected Britain's creativity. If its empire was collapsing, its cultural exports ensured a new kind of soft power. By the 1970s, the United Kingdom had completed a fundamental transformation. It had ceased to be an empire and instead became a medium-sized European power tied more closely to its continental neighbors than at any point in history, yet still anchored by its Commonwealth connections and transatlantic alliance with the United States. The monarchy, embodied by Queen Elizabeth II, adapted to these changes, transitioning from imperial figurehead to national symbol in a multicultural, post-imperial society. The story of Britain in these decades was one of loss and reinvention. The empire that had defined centuries vanished within a single generation, replaced by a complex web of alliances, identities, and global roles. From the independence of India in 1947 to Britain's entry into the EEC in 1973, the UK had shed its imperial skin and begun to chart a new, uncertain course in a rapidly changing world. By the late 1970s, Britain was mired in economic decline, social unrest, and waning confidence in its institutions. The 1978-79 winter of discontent, marked by strikes across public services, uncollected rubbish in the streets, and even the dead left unburied, came to symbolize the failures of the post-war consensus built on strong unions, a managed economy, and expansive welfare. In May 1979, the Conservative Party under Margaret Thatcher won a decisive electoral victory, ending decades of alternating short-lived Labour and Conservative governments, and beginning a new era that would reshape Britain's political and economic landscape. Thatcher, the first woman to become Prime Minister in Britain, governed from May 4, 1979 until November 28, 1990, longer than any other 20th century leader. Her policies, rooted in free market economics and influenced by monetarist ideas, sought to reverse what she saw as Britain's terminal decline. She pursued aggressive deregulation, reduced the power of trade unions, privatized state-owned industries such as British Telecom, 1984, British Gas, 1986, British Airways, 1987, and British Steel, 1988, and emphasized individual enterprise. These reforms, known collectively as Thatcherism, radically shifted Britain's economic structure from manufacturing to finance and services, particularly centered in London. Yet Thatcher's policies were deeply divisive. The early 1980s saw unemployment rise above 3 million by 1982, the highest since the Great Depression, devastating traditional industrial communities in northern England, Scotland, and Wales. The miners' strike of 1984 to 85, led by Arthur Scargill and the National Union of Mine Workers, NUM, became the defining domestic battle of her premiership. Thatcher refused to compromise, deploying police in large numbers and framing the strike as a fight for Britain's economic future. The strike collapsed in March 1985 without achieving its goals, breaking the back of the trade union movement and cementing Thatcher's dominance. Internationally, Thatcher asserted Britain's military and diplomatic role. In April 1982, Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, a British overseas territory in the South Atlantic. Thatcher's government dispatched a naval task force that retook the islands after a 10-week conflict, ending on June 14, 1982, with Argentina's surrender. The Falklands War restored national pride, strengthened Thatcher politically, and contributed to her landslide re-election in June 1983. Her close partnership with U.S. President Ronald Reagan further defined her era, both leaders embracing free markets, a tough stance against the Soviet Union, and neoliberal reforms. She also played a significant role in Cold War diplomacy, supporting NATO's deployment of U.S. nuclear missiles in Britain while maintaining dialogue with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, whom she famously described in 1984 as a man we can do business with. At home, Thatcher faced mounting criticism over social inequality. While London thrived as a financial hub following deregulation in 1986, the so-called Big Bang, many former industrial areas declined into long-term unemployment and poverty. Riots in Brixton, Toxteth, and other urban areas in 1981 and 1985 reflected racial tensions, police community mistrust, and social exclusion. Her introduction of the community charge, widely known as the poll tax, in Scotland in 1989 and England and Wales in 1990, provoked widespread protests, culminating in violent demonstrations in London on March 31, 1990. Amid internal Conservative Party unrest, Thatcher resigned on November 28, 1990, succeeded by John Major. Major, who governed until 1997, represented continuity but also moderation compared to Thatcher. He presided over Britain's involvement in the Gulf War of 1991, supporting the U.S.-led coalition against Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. Domestically, he inherited an economic recession, worsened by Britain's forced withdrawal from the European Exchange Rate Mechanism, ERM, on Black Wednesday, September 16, 1992, after a speculative attack on the pound. The humiliation undermined conservative credibility. By the mid-1990s, after 18 years of conservative rule, Britain was ready for change. The Labour Party, revitalized under Tony Blair, rebranded itself as New Labour, embracing a centrist third way that combined market economics with social investment. On May 1, 1997, Labour won a landslide victory, capturing 418 seats to the Conservatives' 165, the largest Labour majority in history. Blair became Prime Minister at 43, the youngest since 1812, promising modernization and optimism under the slogan, "Things can only get better." Blair's premiership, 1997 to 2007, was transformative. Domestically, his government introduced the minimum wage in 1999, invested heavily in health and education, and advanced constitutional reforms. Devolution became a landmark achievement. The Scotland Act 1998 created the Scottish Parliament. The Government of Wales Act 1998 established the National Assembly for Wales, and power-sharing institutions were set up in Northern Ireland. On April 10, 1998, after months of negotiations chaired by U.S. Senator George Mitchell, the Good Friday Agreement was signed, bringing an end to 3 decades of the Troubles. The agreement established devolved government in Northern Ireland, recognized the principle of consent regarding its status, and disarmed paramilitary groups over time. Blair's government also pursued reforms in the House of Lords, removing most hereditary peers through the House of Lords Act 1999 and passed the Human Rights Act 1998, incorporating the European Convention on Human Rights into British law. His popularity soared in the early years, bolstered by a booming economy, modernization, and Britain's hosting of cultural triumphs like Cool Britannia, symbolized by the global success of British music, fashion, and art. Internationally, Blair sought to position Britain as a global moral leader. He intervened militarily in Kosovo in 1999, supporting NATO's campaign against Serbian forces, and in Sierra Leone in 2000, where British troops helped stabilize a brutal civil war. However, Blair's reputation was defined and ultimately tarnished by his unwavering support for U.S. President George W. Bush in the War on Terror. After the September 11th attacks in 2001, Britain joined the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan to overthrow the Taliban. More controversially, in March 2003, Blair committed British forces to the invasion of Iraq, arguing that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. The failure to find such weapons, coupled with years of bloody insurgency, deeply damaged his credibility and led to mass protests, most notably the February 15, 2003 anti-war march in London, the largest in British history. Despite this, Blair won re-election in 2001 and again in 2005, though with reduced majorities. By 2007, public discontent over Iraq, concerns about growing inequality, and fatigue with New Labour led Blair to resign, handing power to his Chancellor, Gordon Brown. His decade in office, however, had fundamentally reshaped British politics, embedding devolution, modernizing public services, and positioning Britain as both a global player and a nation grappling with the legacies of empire and the challenges of globalization. The period from 1979 to 2007 was thus one of profound upheaval. Thatcher's revolution dismantled the old post-war order, redefining Britain's economy and politics, though at immense social cost. Major carried forward a fragile equilibrium, especially in Ireland, before Blair's New Labour ushered in an era of optimism, reform, and renewed international activism. Yet by its end, Britain stood deeply divided over the legacies of Thatcherism, the costs of globalization, and the controversies of Iraq, tensions that would resurface with even greater force in the decades to follow. From 2007 onward, Britain entered a turbulent phase marked by economic upheaval, political instability, constitutional debates, and shifting global dynamics. Gordon Brown, who had served as Chancellor of the Exchequer for a decade, succeeded Tony Blair as Prime Minister on June 27, 2007. Brown inherited both the successes and strains of New Labour's long dominance. Initially, his premiership was greeted with a degree of optimism, particularly during crises such as the 2007 Glasgow airport attack and severe summer flooding, where his calm responses won praise. However, his government soon faced challenges that would define his time in office and contribute to Labour's decline. The global financial crisis erupted in 2007-08. Britain, heavily dependent on its financial sector after decades of deindustrialization, was particularly vulnerable. The collapse of Northern Rock in September 2007, the first run on a British bank in more than a century, exposed fragility in the financial system. By 2008, the crisis deepened. Major institutions such as the Royal Bank of Scotland and Lloyd's TSB required massive government bailouts. Brown's government responded with unprecedented measures, including partial nationalization of banks, liquidity injections, and fiscal stimulus. Though many economists credited Brown with preventing systemic collapse, the aftermath left Britain with soaring public debt and austerity debates that would dominate politics for the next decade. Internationally, Brown continued Britain's involvement in the War on Terror, maintaining troop deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. By 2009, British combat operations in Basra were winding down, but casualties in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, surged, fueling public opposition. Meanwhile, Brown sought to position Britain as a leader in global governance, hosting the G20 summit in London in April 2009 to coordinate international responses to the economic crisis. Despite these efforts, his personal authority weakened. Media narratives painted him as indecisive and dour compared to Blair's charisma. Scandals over MPs' expenses in 2009 further eroded trust in Parliament, tarnishing all parties but particularly damaging Labour's standing. In the general election of May 6, 2010, no party won an outright majority, the first hung parliament since February 1974. The Conservatives, led by David Cameron, secured 306 seats, Labour 258, and the Liberal Democrats 57. After days of negotiation, Cameron formed a coalition government with Liberal Democrat leader Nick Clegg, who became Deputy Prime Minister. Brown resigned on May 11, 2010, ending 13 years of Labour rule. The Cameron-Clegg coalition, 2010-15, became synonymous with austerity. Chancellor George Osborne introduced deep spending cuts to reduce the budget deficit, reshaping welfare, public services, and local government funding. These policies disproportionately affected poorer communities, exacerbating inequality. Riots in August 2011, triggered by the police shooting of Mark Duggan in Tottenham, quickly spread across London and other cities, reflecting deep social discontent. Cameron also faced foreign policy challenges, including Britain's role in the 2011 NATO intervention in Libya, which helped topple Muammar Gaddafi but left the country unstable. A defining constitutional moment came with the Scottish independence referendum. The Scottish National Party, SNP, led by Alex Salmond, had won a majority in the Scottish Parliament in May 2011 and secured a referendum agreement with Cameron's government in the 2012 Edinburgh Agreement. On September 18, 2014, Scots voted 55.3% to 44.7% against independence, with a record turnout of 84.6%. Though the Union survived, the referendum energized Scottish nationalism and reshaped UK politics. Another constitutional fissure emerged over Britain's relationship with the European Union. Euroscepticism, long simmering within the Conservative Party, intensified amid economic pressures and migration debates. In January 2013, Cameron promised a referendum on EU membership if re-elected. Meanwhile, UKIP, UK Independence Party, surged in popularity, capturing significant shares of the vote in European Parliament elections in 2014. In the May 2015 general election, the Conservatives won an outright majority with 331 seats, while Labour under Ed Miliband suffered losses and the Liberal Democrats collapsed to just 8 MPs. Cameron now governed without coalition constraints. That same year, Parliament legalized same-sex marriage, passed in 2013 and effective by March 2014 in England and Wales, later in Scotland, marking a profound social transformation. Cameron also called the promised EU referendum. On June 23, 2016, the United Kingdom voted 51.9% to 48.1% to leave the European Union, with England and Wales backing leave, while Scotland and Northern Ireland voted remain. The Brexit referendum revealed sharp divisions between generations, regions, and social classes. Cameron, who had campaigned for Remain, resigned on June 24, 2016. Theresa May succeeded him on July 13, 2016, pledging that Brexit means Brexit. May's premiership, 2016-19, was consumed by the Brexit process. Her government triggered Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty on March 29, 2017, beginning the 2-year countdown to withdrawal. She called a snap election for June 8, 2017, hoping to strengthen her majority, but instead lost it, forcing reliance on the Democratic Unionist Party, DUP, of Northern Ireland. This alliance complicated Brexit negotiations as the issue of the Irish border became central. May reached a withdrawal agreement with the EU in November 2018, but repeated rejections in Parliament left the process in deadlock. Facing rebellion within her party, she resigned on July 24, 2019. Boris Johnson, who had led the Leave campaign, replaced May. Johnson almost immediately, the COVID-19 pandemic struck. Britain confirmed its first cases in late January 2020 and entered national lockdown on March 23. The crisis tested government capacity and public health. Johnson himself was hospitalized in April 2020 with severe illness. His government implemented furlough schemes, vaccine procurement, and successive lockdowns, but faced criticism over delayed responses, shortages of protective equipment, and later revelations of government officials breaching lockdown rules. By mid-2022, Britain had recorded over 200,000 COVID-related deaths, one of the highest tolls in Europe. Johnson's premiership also navigated constitutional tensions. In Scotland, the SNP under Nicola Sturgeon renewed calls for independence, arguing that Brexit had altered Scotland's place in the Union. In Northern Ireland, the post-Brexit trade arrangements created political strain, contributing to renewed instability in the power-sharing system. Meanwhile, Johnson's government pursued a global Britain strategy, seeking new trade deals and emphasizing military and diplomatic presence, including support for Ukraine after Russia's invasion on February 24, 2022. The domestic scandal ultimately undermined Johnson. Revelations in late 2021 and 2022 of illegal gatherings at Downing Street during lockdown, known as Partygate, eroded his authority. On July 7, 2022, amid mass cabinet resignations, Johnson announced his intention to resign. Liz Truss succeeded him on September 6, 2022, but lasted only 49 days, the shortest premiership in British history, undone by a disastrous mini-budget that triggered financial turmoil. She resigned on October 20, 2022. Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister on October 25, 2022, inheriting a country facing inflation, energy crises, and strained public services. His leadership sought stability after years of upheaval, though debates over Brexit's economic consequences, constitutional tensions within the United Kingdom, and Britain's global role continued to shape the political landscape. Thus, from Brown's inheritance of financial collapse in 2007 through Cameron's austerity, the Scottish referendum, Brexit's seismic rupture, the pandemic, and the rapid turnover of leaders in the early 2020s, Britain experienced one of the most volatile periods in its modern history. Each crisis exposed deeper structural divisions over identity, economy, and governance, divisions that continued to define the United Kingdom into the mid-2020s. As the 2020s unfolded, the United Kingdom stood at a crossroads defined by the legacies of Brexit, the COVID-19 pandemic, and mounting constitutional, economic, and geopolitical pressures. Rishi Sunak, who entered office as Prime Minister on October 25, 2022, inherited a political system shaken by years of turmoil. His appointment followed the implosion of Liz Truss's premiership, which collapsed after just 49 days when her mini-budget of September 23, 2022 triggered a financial crisis, sending bond yields soaring and collapsing confidence in Britain's economic management. Sunak's immediate priority was restoring market credibility, and his chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, swiftly reversed most of Truss's tax cuts. Sunak's government emphasized economic stability, promising fiscal discipline while confronting soaring inflation, which peaked at 11.1% in October 2022, the highest in over 4 decades. Rising energy costs, exacerbated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022, compounded the crisis. The UK joined Western allies in imposing sanctions on Moscow, supplying weapons to Kiev, and hosting Ukrainian refugees. The war reinforced Britain's foreign policy pivot towards hard power and its global Britain posture after Brexit, but domestically, it magnified cost of living pressures. Industrial unrest surged, with waves of strikes in 2022 to 23 involving rail workers, nurses, teachers, and other sectors demanding pay rises amid inflation. At the same time, the aftershocks of Brexit continued to reshape Britain's politics. The Northern Ireland Protocol, part of the UK-EU withdrawal agreement, became a flashpoint. Its provisions, designed to prevent a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland by effectively placing customs checks in the Irish Sea, alienated Unionist communities. Political deadlock ensued as the Democratic Unionist Party, DUP, refused to participate in Northern Ireland's devolved government at Stormont. In February 2023, Sunak negotiated the Windsor Framework with European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, modifying customs procedures and granting the Northern Irish Assembly a Stormont break on future EU regulations. This deal aimed to stabilize relations with Brussels and revive power sharing in Belfast, though tensions lingered. Constitutionally, questions about the unity of the UK remained acute. In Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon's resignation as First Minister in February 2023 marked the end of an era in Scottish politics, but the Scottish National Party, SNP, remained committed to independence. Sturgeon's successor, Humza Yousaf, reaffirmed calls for another referendum, though the UK Supreme Court had ruled in November 2022 that the Scottish Parliament lacked unilateral authority to hold one. This tension kept alive debates over sovereignty and the durability of the 1707 Union. In Wales, calls for greater autonomy grew but stopped short of mainstream independence movements. Internationally, Britain faced the challenge of redefining its place outside the EU. Trade deals were pursued with countries such as Australia, signed December 2021, ratified 2023, and accession talks advanced for the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, with the UK formally joining on July 16, 2023. However, economic data indicated that post-Brexit trade with the EU, still Britain's largest partner, had declined, raising questions about the long-term economic cost of departure. Efforts to build bilateral ties with the United States faltered, as a comprehensive UK-US trade deal remained elusive into the mid-2020s. Sunak's government also managed Britain's evolving relationship with the monarchy. The death of Queen Elizabeth II on September 8, 2022, after a reign of 70 years, marked the end of a historical epoch. Her son, Charles III, ascended the throne, symbolizing continuity amid change. His coronation on May 6, 2023 blended tradition with modern adjustments, drawing global attention and reaffirming the monarchy's symbolic role. Yet debates over republicanism gained traction in parts of the UK and the Commonwealth. Several Caribbean nations, including Jamaica, signaled intentions to remove the British monarch as head of state, continuing the post-imperial process of disentanglement. Domestically, politics remained volatile. The Conservative Party, in power since 2010, faced declining popularity amid scandals, economic hardship, and fatigue after years of instability. The Labour Party under Keir Starmer regained momentum, presenting itself as a government in waiting by 2023. Polls consistently showed Labour leading by double digits, raising the prospect of a political realignment in the next general election, due no later than January 2025. Socially, Britain continued grappling with questions of identity, diversity, and its place in the world. Immigration remained a contentious issue. Sunak's government pursued a controversial policy of deporting asylum seekers to Rwanda, first announced under Johnson in April 2022. Legal challenges repeatedly delayed its implementation, and by 2023, it had yet to be enacted. The policy drew criticism from human rights groups and the United Nations, highlighting divisions over migration policy in the post-Brexit era. Culturally, the United Kingdom's global influence endured through media, education, and the arts, though it competed with rising powers and shifting geopolitical currents. Universities remained internationally prestigious, but funding pressures and disputes over tuition fees stirred domestic debate. Britain's role in science and technology expanded, particularly in artificial intelligence, life sciences, and defense industries, aligning with Sunak's rhetoric about positioning the country as a global hub for innovation. By 2024, as the next general election loomed, the UK confronted a matrix of unresolved challenges: sluggish economic growth, strained public services after years of austerity, and pandemic disruption, ongoing disputes over Brexit's legacy, and enduring constitutional questions from Scotland and Northern Ireland. Meanwhile, Britain maintained its status as a leading NATO member, sending military aid to Ukraine and increasing defense spending in response to global insecurity. Through these years, the United Kingdom's trajectory was defined by the interplay of continuity and upheaval. The constitutional monarchy, parliamentary democracy, and union of nations persisted, yet the stresses of economic turbulence, Brexit's structural shifts, pandemic scars, and the shifting balance of global power forced constant adaptation. By the mid-2020s, the UK remained a significant global actor, but one preoccupied with internal debates about identity, governance, and its post-imperial role in a changing world. This period, from the financial collapse of 2007 through the economic realignments, the upheavals of Brexit, the global pandemic, and the early reign of Charles III, represented one of the most transformative phases in modern British history, an era that would shape the monarchy, central to British tradition, entered a new phase following the death of Queen Elizabeth II on September 8, 2022. Her 70-year reign, the longest in British history, had symbolized continuity from the Second World War through the Information Age. The accession of Charles III introduced a monarch who sought a slimmed-down institution, aiming to balance tradition with modern expectations. His coronation on May 6, 2023 in Westminster Abbey was watched worldwide, but surveys indicated waning enthusiasm for the monarchy, particularly among younger generations and in devolved nations. At the same time, Commonwealth states from Barbados, which became a republic in 2021, to Jamaica openly considered removing the British monarch as head of state, signaling the steady retreat of royal influence abroad. Domestically, the Union faced pressure on multiple fronts. Scotland, governed by the Scottish National Party since 2007, pressed its case for independence after the Brexit referendum of June 23, 2016 revealed a profound divide. Scotland voted 62% to remain in the European Union, while the UK as a whole voted 52% to leave. Although the 2014 referendum on Scottish independence had resulted in 55% voting to remain within the UK, the changed circumstances revived the issue. The UK Supreme Court ruled on November 23, 2022 that the Scottish Parliament could not unilaterally legislate for a second referendum, but the political demand did not fade. In Northern Ireland, the fragile settlement established by the 1998 Good Friday Agreement was repeatedly tested by the practicalities of Brexit. The Northern Ireland Protocol, renegotiated as the Windsor Framework in February 2023, attempted to preserve both the open Irish border and Northern Ireland's constitutional status within the UK, but it exposed the ongoing tension between unionist and nationalist communities. Economically, the UK faced challenges in maintaining growth while adjusting to its new relationship with the EU. Trade statistics showed significant friction, with small businesses particularly affected by customs and regulatory barriers. Despite securing trade agreements with Australia, signed December 2021, and joining the CPTPP in July 2023, the economic weight of the EU remained central. Inflation, which spiked in 2022 due to energy shocks following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, slowly declined by 2024, but real wages stagnated, and public services strained after years of austerity. The National Health Service, founded in 1948, remained a pillar of national identity but endured unprecedented pressure from staffing shortages, waiting lists, and funding disputes. Foreign policy positioned the UK as an active NATO member. Britain was one of the earliest European states to supply Ukraine with advanced weapons systems, including NLAW anti-tank missiles in early 2022 and Challenger 2 tanks in 2023. It hosted NATO's 2023 Vilnius summit and committed to raising defense spending above 2% of GDP. Yet debates continued over Britain's global posture, whether to pursue a distinctly global Britain strategy centered on maritime power and the Indo-Pacific, or to remain tethered primarily to European security concerns. Culturally, Britain's influence remained disproportionate to its size. London, with its financial institutions, universities, and media networks, retained its status as a global hub. British music, television, and literature continued to reach international audiences, while Premier League football drew billions of viewers worldwide. However, internal debates over identity sharpened. Immigration remained a point of contention, particularly with the government's proposed Rwanda asylum scheme, first announced in April 2022, upheld by the Court of Appeal in 2023, but suspended after a Supreme Court ruling on November 15, 2023, declaring Rwanda unsafe. These debates exposed divisions not only over policy, but over what it meant to be British in a diverse, multi-ethnic society. Technological innovation offered opportunities for renewal. Britain remained a leader in artificial intelligence research, biotechnology, and defense technology. The government positioned itself as a regulatory pioneer with the AI Safety Summit held at Bletchley Park in November 2023, signaling a desire to shape global standards. Yet long-term concerns about productivity, inequality between London and the regions, and climate policy remained unresolved. Britain's 2050 net zero carbon emissions target, enshrined in law in 2019, faced obstacles from political